Hello, thank you so much for dropping by. Wow, just had this amazing conversation with someone, and they were reading a spiritual book. And, this book, one of the things it taught about was the ego. And, it was really just hammering it in what the ego is, how it motivates behavior, to watch out for it, da 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 da. And then this person then got caught in the observing themselves and observing everyone else and being like, oh my gosh, what they're doing is based on ego. Oh my gosh, what I just did was based on ego. And just kind of got caught in this cycle of like seeing ego everywhere. And I can really relate to this. So it's a really interesting point on the spiritual path. So the thing is, in different traditions call it by different names. In the East, they call it ego, and in the West, they tend to call it evil. But what's important to recognize is that there is a negative force. That doesn't necessarily mean it's outside of us. All the non-duality people don't freak out, but there is something that motivates behavior and choices that is not good. And there's so many different ways of looking at it and talking about it. But the first is just that recognition. And all we need to do is observe ourselves and other people to see this, Here's a great example. Today I couldn't find my keys. And so, I went to different places that I thought it might be. And then at a certain point, I started to feel a little frantic because I was trying to get to a certain place on time. And the moment that franticness came in, then my behavior became a little erratic. Like I wasn't being so logical. I certainly wasn't being intuitive. I wasn't like, oh, I need to go check here. It was just kind of like I was wandering from room to room and the negative thoughts were starting to ruminate. It's like, oh my gosh, I've got to get there on time. I'm going to be late. Da, 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 da. So that's an example of ego or evil or the negative impacting me and impacting my behavior. So let's pause for a moment and really define ego. And, in the East, in the West, we have a very different definition of ego than they do in Eastern spiritual traditions. So it's important to really understand, in the West, ego is our sense of self, and it can be healthy or unhealthy. In the East, ego is the root cause of all of our suffering. It's that which causes all of our suffering and that which keeps us separate from the divine, even separate from God. So very different concepts. An ego in the East, it's literally that which is untrue, which we think about ourselves, which keep us separate from the divine and separate from God. So there I was caught up in ego, or if you want to look at it from a Western perspective, caught up in evil. I was feeling a little panicky. I was feeling frantic. My thoughts were racing. My behavior was, stressful. So something was driving me, something not good. And so it's very important to be aware that this thing, and I'm leaving it vague on purpose because there are different paradigms and different views. But it's very important to be aware that there is a thing that will drive us in a very dark direction. Now, okay, that was just 10, 15 minutes. I'm a little embarrassed to say it went on for 15 minutes. But when that takes a habit, when thinking and behaving like that takes a habit, it will take a person down a very dark road. Then panic and worry becomes a way of life, and then we need to cope with it with addictions, and then da 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 da. So, from the Eastern perspective, ego is not a little thing. It's that which causes all our suffering. And if we let it drive us enough, it drives us very far down the hole into suffering, misery, and dysfunction. So it's very important to be aware of that, but it's also very important to be aware of the other force, that the other power that drives us, and whether you call it God, higher self, true self, or inspiration, it depends sort of on your religious spiritual orientation. But, for example, someone today was telling me a situation they were dealing with in their life, and just I listened, and then I just kind of felt into what they were saying, and kind of the right words came, like words that were helpful, that really spoke to their situation. So if we observe ourselves, we'll notice that throughout the day, sometimes we do things that are just like in the flow. Like sometimes we do things where we're like bumping against life, like I was today looking for my keys. And sometimes we do things that just kind of flow with life and contribute with life. So in the recognition that there is this force, or ego could be called a state of consciousness. It could be called an energy. In the recognition that there is this negative energy that drives us and leads us down unfun paths, it's very important to recognize the other, inspiration. There's a book called Zero Limits, and I hesitate to mention it because it makes some very bold metaphysical claims that I personally don't agree with. But one of the fundamental principles of it is that moment by moment, we're driven by fear, which it says is basically something from the past, or inspiration. Now, I don't necessarily take that literally, but that's a very powerful way to live, is to notice, hey, moment by moment, we're driven. Moment by moment, we are driven to think, feel, and act. All day long, we're driven. The question is, what are we driven by? Are we driven by compassion, wisdom, inspiration, presence? Or are we driven by resentment, fear, worry, gluttony? And as we begin to observe and become aware of these two ways of being, these two very fundamental energies, not necessarily energies outside of ourselves, but also not just inside ourselves, then some choice comes in as to which energy which way of being to engage with. One of my deepest, if not my deepest spiritual heroes, Bruno Gröning, said it like this. He said, the human being is like a satellite dish, like a radio antenna. And that moment by moment, we're literally tuning in to one of two stations. He called it good and evil, not necessarily in the human sense of the word. Good, that which nourishes life. Evil, that which is harmful or destructive to life. And along with it, that we're tuning into thoughts that move us forward and support life, and thoughts which are harmful to life. And he just said, that's basically what life is moment by moment, we're tuning in to one of two stations. Now that's a very profound, he was speaking both metaphorically and literally. He said the soul has the capacity to receive. The question is, what are you receiving? Or as he so eloquently, he called the practice he taught, he called it Einstellen. He was German, and that's a German word with many meanings, but one of them is to tune in. So moment by moment, what are we tuning into? Because what we tune into, that's what drives us. So I really, it can be scary to recognize, because, the other thing is, in the West, ego is like, it's just a little thing, whereas in the East, it's like, um, it's a very driving force in human destiny, this thing called ego in Eastern philosophy. So it can be a bit of a shock to recognize that, oh my gosh, I mean, it's a shock for children to recognize that there's evil in the world, that there's maliciousness or ill will in the world. And it can be a shock for us on the spiritual path to recognize that, wow, there's something inside me and seemingly in other people and in this world that is not, that has ill will. Doesn't mean well. It doesn't play nice. But we also need to not. So that's can be a bit of a. But we also don't want to, lose the big picture, which is that that's not the only reality, and that there is another source of assistance that can guide us and drive us and hold us and support us through this mystery called life. So becoming aware of the ego, becoming aware of evil, life-changing realization. And then we don't want to, but that's not the whole picture. There's this other piece of inspiration, of guidance, of higher self. And, the whole spiritual path in essence is learning how to tune in and to have patience with ourselves, because we're human beings. We're gonna fall short. Sometimes we're gonna tune in. And we have a habit of tuning in to that which isn't helpful. Like I said, 15 minutes, I knew better than to worry and to fret and to like wander the house randomly, checking the same pocket in my backpack 5 times. And we fall short. We're, perfectly imperfect on this amazing evolutionary growth journey. Thanks so much for dropping by. Questions, comments, feedback, very welcome. Take care. Much love.